Welcome. So great to see all of your faces. And we are joined by a massive crowd of people in Zoom. They all made it and we're connected and everybody is here. Hello, Zoomers from Ireland, Australia, Germany, England, Seattle, West Coast, East Coast. I've lost track. But thank you for your efforts and lovely to see you all here. So, just a moment. Let me just take a break. We've got friends here in person from all generations, from all countries, from all experiences, from youngest to longest friends. I've got a school friend here from when I was as old as his daughter is, sitting next to him at age 11. And then there's friends, the Martins from Ethiopia, who are right here. We met in Ethiopia when, through Howard and their son Seth, when they were 5. 4! Oh my goodness. 4, imagine that. So, it's just quite the gathering. And then we've got everybody's extended family too, so it's really great to see everybody. Thank you again for coming. And last but not least, thank you, Eric and Norman, for facilitating this connection, because that's been an enormous help to just forget about it and put it in your trusty hands. So thank you, thank you, thank you. Anyway, so I think I've forgotten what's on our list. What's next? The obituary? The obituary reading? Okay. So we're going to have Norman, did somebody say something? Oh, okay. Norman is going to read the obituary, which was put together by us, but mainly by Jennifer. Thank you very much with her beautiful handwritten touch. But we all put our brains in, and that's what you guys have seen. So, Norman, I'll pass it on to you.
Thank you. Vilma Alteah Scott, née Howard, passed away on February 2025 at the Viera Skilled Nursing and Rehabilitation Facility in Falls Church, Virginia, at the young age of 95.
Talking to the mic, Mom.
All right. Better?
Raise it up.
Raise it up a bit. All right. How we doing? Better?
Yeah.
You good? All right. She was born in Mobile, Alabama on May 26, 1929, where she spent the first 5 years of her life. She had a brother, Julius, who was 2 years older. In 1934, after her parents' separation, her mother brought the 2 children up north to New York in the hopes of a better life with more opportunities for herself and her children. Vilma got an excellent high school education at her local public school. After graduating in 1947, she went to Fisk University in Tennessee, where she obtained a bachelor's degree in literature and philosophy in 1951. After returning home to Harlem, New York, she was frustrated by the lack of career opportunities for a black woman in the 50s and felt oppressed by the restrictions of a Jim Crow-era America. She decided to go abroad. For 3 years, she worked as a Blue Cross telephone operator in New York City until she had saved enough money to go to Europe and stay for a while. In Paris, in 1954, she became a student at the Sorbonne, where she took a course in French civilization, Études de la civilisation française. She fell in with a multicultural crowd of American and British expats, one of whom was to be her future husband. Vilma and Christopher Scott were married in London in November 1955. Their 3 children were born between 1958 and 1962. Since Chris was English, they started their married years in London. However, they loved to travel, and in 1961 they left England. Over the course of the next 12 years, Chris's work took them to Africa and Europe, where they made many lifelong friends. This included Ethiopia twice, Morocco, and Ghana, returning to Europe in 1970, where they spent 3 years in Paris. In 1973, they returned to England and bought a house in Highgate in North London. Vilma, having had enough of travel at this point, stayed put with the kids while Chris continued to go on short trips for work. They still lived there when Chris died in 1998, when Vilma was 68. She continued living there on her own until the ripe age of 92. This was her beloved home for almost 50 years, where she became a Londoner, making friends and connections, and engaging in all the artistic and gardening activities that she loved. To her dismay, poor health determined that she move out of her home. She moved back to the US in 2021 to be closer to her children, now living in the States. She lived with her son Howard and daughter-in-law Laura in their home in Alexandria, Virginia, for 3 years until her final days. There, she was closely cared for by them as well as by Christina for those 3 years. She is survived by her 3 children, Christina, Jennifer, and Howard, and two grandchildren, Desta and Alexandra.
You'll notice that the obituary that you've got in the pamphlet is a bit longer. We wanted to kept adding more stuff. But we just read out the short version. So I wanted to read some extracts from a sort of memoir I was writing. I started a year ago as part of a memoir workshop where I actually was able to ask my mom questions so she could fill in some things. And it's turned out to be a little bit long, so I'm going to divide it into 3 parts. And so I'll read the first part, and then other people can come give tributes, and then I'll read.
Just the mic to be closer to you.
So I'll read the first part, and then I'll invite other people to talk, and then I'll read the second part, invite people to talk, and then I'll read the third part, if there's time. Okay. After my father died, I had a period of great anxiety that my mum, who was only 68 at the time, would soon follow. Oh no, she chuckled, no need to worry about that. I come from a family where everyone lives into their 90s or beyond. I'm going to be around for a very long time. And she was right. She had another 27 years to go. Her 95 years took her in many unexpected directions. Yet for a long time, I didn't know much about her life before we kids came along. While our dad would spontaneously relate happy stories of his childhood, for some reason our mum was strangely silent on the subject. As a result, we had a pretty good idea what his childhood had been like, but knew relatively little about hers. By the time I was 14, I began to wonder why. So I began asking questions. Of course, we knew she was originally from Mobile, Alabama, where she was born Vilma Alteah Howard on May 26, 1929. Her parents, Beatrice Giles and Julius Clifford Howard, were married in Mobile, Alabama in 1925. Her mother was only 19 at the time. Her older brother, Julius Laverne Howard, was born there in 1927. Yet, even after 70 years away, she always identified proudly as a New Yorker. It was where she had spent her most formative years. When I ventured to ask her for memories of Mobile, she offered only 2, as a baby being taken along by her mother to her job as a domestic servant, and being set down outside to sit in the shade of a tree while her mother worked. And another time playing with cousins on the porch, children of her mother's many siblings. She smiled when she recounted that memory, but if I asked for more, she would say with a dismissive irritation, I don't really remember much at all. I was only 5 when we left. When I pushed her a little further, she relented reluctantly. It was all dismal poverty and struggle. I really don't want to remember it, glaring at me for my perseverance. I spent all my life trying to forget it. She had grown up in Jim Crow America, where she could never for a minute escape being black, with all the closed doors and negative judgment that came with it. The rage she felt at the treatment she received from her own country never left her, no matter how long she remained away. She'd seen firsthand her own mother's struggles to financially support her own family in a world that dictated that, as a black woman, you were not worth more than pittance wages and menial labor. It gutted her to see how her once strong and capable mother had become depleted and self-effacing. She tried to avoid thinking about how her brother had gone from a boy full of youthful hopes and dreams to abandoning those dreams one by one until he had nothing much to look forward to. I made sure you did not grow up in America. I thought that would be all you would need to get a good start in life. It didn't occur to me to look any further than that, she said, with a sigh and a depreciating jest at her own naivety. She did not remember her father. In 1934, when she was 5, our grandmother, Nana, left him after she discovered he was fooling around with her best friend. Hoping for a better life with more opportunities for her children, Nana then left everything she had known in her home state of Alabama, where she had many sisters, and moved herself and the 2 children, aged 5 and 7, up north to New York City, where she moved in with some cousins and their family. Recently, it occurred to me that historically they were part of the Great Migration, the movement of large numbers of black Americans during the first half of the 20th century away from Jim Crow's southern states in hopes of better lives up north. Yeah, I guess we were, said my mom with a self-conscious chuckle. I had just given her a Jacob Lawrence calendar, an African-American artist that the 2 of us admire, and the painting for that month was from one of his Great Migration series, depicting this northward movement of African-Americans during the first half of the 1900s. We were just living our lives. You don't go around thinking you were part of history, she shrugged. The paintings are bright, colorful, and hopeful as crowds of colored folk clamber onto trains, eager for a better life. Did she remember the train journey? Perhaps the excitement of getting on a train with her mom and brother, leaving the only place she had known her whole life? Surely she would remember that. It must have been a huge adventure. But to my disappointment, my mom remembered nothing at all. Perhaps the pain and humiliation of having to travel in separate train cars than whites, assigned the ones that were old, dirty, and run down, with the smaller bathrooms, if any, was too much for my mom, who has always been keenly tuned to Indian fairness. She would describe later trips on those segregated Jim Crow trains to us kids with disgusted indignation. Perhaps such memories were just best left behind. Ma just took a baby under each arm and headed north, was the sum total she could offer me, leaving me only with Jacob Lawrence paintings to fill in the gaps. What my mom did remember, though, was their reception in New York. One day I found a battered black and white photo of a group of women around the kitchen table. Unlike the rigid portrait photos typical of the time that give you very little idea of what people were actually like, this one is packed with character. 3 women are grouped around a kitchen table, one a severe-looking elderly woman, the other 2 strong-willed middle-aged women. The woman on the right is stirring some kind of interesting dish while a little girl holds trustingly onto her arms. The camera appears to have captured an instant in time out of their busy family life. Surely there's a story here. Who were these women? What were they making? What were they talking about? What kind of people were they? How did we fit into this family narrative? I couldn't wait to bring the photo to my mom and bombard her with questions. Ugh! Gasped my mom, recoiling from the photo. Such a visceral reaction took me by surprise. Those were my evil aunts! Apparently these were the aunts, or Nana's cousins, that they had moved in with when they first arrived in New York from Alabama. They were so mean! Then, pointing to the aunt with the toddler, she exclaimed, "That one was the worst!" Why? What did they do? I asked, puzzled. We were not welcome, my mom explained. There were 3 more mouths to feed, not enough room, and from their New York perspective, we were country. Nana was out working all day, so when Julius and Vilma were not in school, they were cared for by the aunts. Julius was always looking out for me, my mom told me, on the rare occasions she talks about her childhood. There were also 2 boy cousins, and Vilma found her days struggling to prove herself against 3 big boys in a world where girls didn't count. Even her loyal brother Julius sometimes let her down. When I got really mad at Julius, I would beat furiously away at him with my fists. She'd go like, and he would just hold me at a distance. He was so much taller than me that all he would do is hold me casually back with one long arm that I couldn't ever reach him, and then laugh at me, which would make me even more furious. She told us this story many times, usually laughing at herself in the telling. I would be furiously beating at him and never actually reaching him, she would laugh, acting out a role with punches to an imaginary Julius. Though she always laughed, you could still see the furious little girl in her. It wasn't fair. I just could never win. It brought to mind what she said about her relationship with my dad in the early years of their relationship. My dad was a master at sounding rational and logical and could argue into a corner with amazing ease. Like Julius, he kept her at arm's length with his logical reasoning skills, while she flailed about ineffectively with counter-arguments that never hit home. I just wanted to win, just once, she sighed, echoing her comment about Julius. One day, all the kids were having one of their many arguments. It wasn't my fault, she told me, but the meanest of the aunts came storming in, grabbed me, and shoved me out the apartment door, slamming the door shut. She was yelling that if I couldn't behave myself, then that's where I belonged. It wasn't until Nana came home hours later, exhausted from a long day's work, that Vilma was rescued and allowed to go back in. Though shocked to find her tear-stained and traumatized daughter shut out in the passageway, Nana kept her mouth shut. They had nowhere else to stay. It took 2 or 3 years before Nana had saved enough to move them out of her cousins. We finally moved into our own place, my mom told me with relief, her body posture visibly relaxing. From then on, it was just the 3 of them, on their own. A little over 30 years later, when we kids were 7, 9, and 11, I met her mother, my Nana, for the first time. Sitting in Nana's Harlem apartment, we were looking at photo albums of my mom as a child and of relatives we didn't recognize. That's your mama too, said Nana, pointing to a picture of a young girl with a serious expression and a graduation cap and gown, graduating from high school. Nana's plan to get her kids to better opportunities than they would have had back in Alabama worked out spectacularly for my mom. My mom would always tell us that she was lucky enough to have been in school during the McCarthy era. At that time, there was a flood of persecuted intellectuals who, chased away from various academic institutions around the country, decided to teach instead at New York public schools. As a result, my mother received an excellent high school education at her local New York public school from some of the best teachers in the country. They challenged the kids' intellect, honed their critical thinking skills, broadened their horizons, and stimulated their thirst for knowledge. This enabled her to get into Fisk University, a historically black university in Tennessee, where she obtained a bachelor's in literature and philosophy. My mother had the distinction of being the first person in her family to get a university degree. I particularly liked the album my mother had put together of her Fisk days. On black scrapbook paper, now framed with age, she had attached black and white photos of all her friends and some of the campus buildings, people and places identified in her elegant hand next to and below the pictures. She and her friends were so stylishly dressed, looking brilliant, very trendy, full of fun, and ready to launch themselves on a world filled with possibilities. At some point, she decided to be brazen and rebellious and got her hair cut short, refusing to ever get it straightened again. Why should beauty be always measured according to what white people look like, she would say. Now the pictures looked like the mother we had always known, with her hair worn in her natural frizz as an afro. And so in the pictures with an afro towards the end of the album, she was finally recognizable. She was absolutely striking, so chic with her short, stylishly trimmed afro, expressive brown eyes, large, dazzling smile, and sassy expression that challenged you to think otherwise. On that visit to Nana's, Julius's ex-wife, Julius is her older brother, Catherine, a slim woman wearing one of those one-piece 60s dresses and pointy framed glasses like in the Gary Lawson cartoons, had been very disapproving about how our mother was bringing us up. What did she mean? We kids asked Mummy when she recounted the story a few years later. Well, you kids were just doing what kids do. You were inquisitive and lively, and for example, there was this one time when we were going somewhere and you saw some stairs and you raced down them, full of curiosity about where they might lead to. She was shocked that you didn't know any better, and she blamed me, she said with a wry face. She thought I was raising you as white kids, she added, looking a bit put out. Then seeing our puzzled expression, she added, black kids in America, like Julius and me when we were kids, you get taught to be careful in everything you do and careful about where you go. Investigating a staircase off the street could be dangerous. Showing curiosity in general can be dangerous. You don't want to stand out. You don't want to give white people a reason to accuse you of something. Looking at our somber expressions, she added, "Yes, I know. That's exactly why I didn't want you growing up in the States." "Were you raising us as white kids?" "No, we were just raising you the way we thought kids should be raised," she explained. She explained that she did not want her own kids to have to be stifled in that way. She and our dad felt children should be allowed to be curious and explore their interests and grow up believing they had the right to learn about the world around them. Though Nana had brought her kids to New York for a better life, they could only get so far. After my mom graduated from Fisk, she returned to New York in 1951, but though she loved her family, she could no longer relate to the world her mother and brother lived in, or they to hers. Unable to land a more intellectually challenging job, she worked for 3 years as a Blue Cross switchboard operator. There were little opportunities for women, let alone black women, in the States. The unfairness of it all and the suppressed rage of a young, highly intelligent woman who wanted more out of life must have been overwhelming, because as soon as she had saved up enough money to travel, she took the first opportunity to get out and see the world. "I wanted to see Europe," she said. She would tell us kids later when she recounted the story, her eyes lighting up. "But I didn't want to go to England. I wanted to go to somewhere where they spoke a different language. And since she had learned French in school, I chose Paris." Okay, I'll stop there before going on and invite other people. We've got Betty and Jackie to say a few words. Come back later.
She's got 3 parts.
She's got 3 parts.
One page. Oh goodness, I probably can't read anything. Right. Dear family and friends, those present here in person and those watching on Zoom. I was asked if I might like to say a few words today about Vilma, because I talked about Chris when he died nearly 27 years ago. I think almost everyone knows they were my uncle and aunt. I now no longer have any uncles, and with Vilma, lost my last aunt. It feels strange to all of us from our generation, to us cousins, to realize we have now moved up one rank, to the top spot, where we are the oldest ones, and none of us have any living parents. I don't know if we're ready, but here we are. Anyway, this talk today is not about us, but about the person we're honoring today, our dear and quite amazing Vilma. But when we talk about a person and remember them, we see them in our eyes as they impacted us. So each one of us will have our own feelings, thoughts, and anecdotes about Vilma today. But that kind of makes it quite interesting, because the story of her life is not just about the turns her life took, but also the legacy she leaves behind. Legacy, as I see it, is not just about the imprint on our genes, but the imprint she leaves on all of us, on our thoughts and views, on our minds. Excuse me. Vilma changed me, and maybe all of us. My aunt was black. I grew up in very white Germany. As a child, and being naive like a child, I was full of awe and also envy. Envy that her skin was so beautifully brown and mine just boring old pink. Or that she was so stunning and far more interesting and well-traveled than most I knew. One time, when I was perhaps 9 years old, I remember walking through a German city centre with her, and I couldn't help wondering, would people maybe, just maybe, think she was my mom? But like I said, I was naive and had no idea of struggles and prejudice and racism, but I learned quite a lot over the years. And who better to teach me than my aunt? Well, she certainly put me right, and in my place a whole bunch of times. For that was Vilma too, feisty, often fearless and outspoken, a fighter. Sometimes we'd clash, and certainly we had many, many enlightening discussions. She was a strong and occasionally stubborn woman, but also incredibly smart. A woman ahead of her time, so often in her life. I thank her for opening my eyes, for making me see more sides of life, for always showing us that women are strong. So here we are, all of us, together today, but feeling this void she leaves behind. We really miss you, Vilma. You will always be a part of my mind.
Are you feeling up for?
Want me to stand up?
Sure. Or do you want to? You can sit if you want. No. No. Sorry, the video director.
I'm sure you're getting terrified. Hi, I'm Betty Martin. I'm going to be shorter than Jackie, who was quite eloquent. Jean, my husband, and I met Vilma, as you know, when our sons became friends at the age of 4 in Addis Ababa. And at that point, our families intertwined. I don't know how to do it in sign language. The sign is this. We just became fast friends, all of us. The children, the parents, we interacted. Everybody liked each other. When we both lived in Addis, we only were there probably about a year together, and after that we never lived in the same city again, but we were fast friends for almost 60 years. So many visits back and forth to Paris and London and DC. And I just have a couple of things to talk about. My memories of Vilma, since she died, I've had this kaleidoscope going through my head of all the things we've done together and all of the conversations we've had. Vilma loved to travel, and she and Chris traveled widely. She was intrepid. And I remember with delight a couple of trips we took together. One simple one, when we were in Ethiopia, we had a picnic on the edge of the Rift Valley. Now, the Rift Valley, when you stand at the edge and you look down, it's 8,000 feet. And Chris went to the edge, got on one leg, and scared the shit out of Vilma and me. And there was a lot of our interaction where the four of us were together, where Chris did something that scared us. When we were in Morocco together, we were driving up into the Atlas in a small car, and Chris was driving a little crazy the way Chris drove. And Vilma and I huddled in the back seat together, and Vilma ignored Chris. Jean was riding shotgun. He was not too happy. And we were picking the hotels we wanted to go to and the places we wanted to see. And what I loved about Vilma was her curiosity. The memories of these trips are precious to me because Vilma was great fun. She was curious. She always delighted to look in on another culture, which I do too. One reason we were such good friends. Vilma had many talents. She read widely. She had a deep knowledge of what was going on in the world always.
Tom, Holly, Jennifer, Lucy, Claire, Howard.
Oops. Technology interferes again. I was very impressed. It says in her obituary, she taught English as a second language to the Japanese students. They liked her so much, they admired her so much, they invited her to come to Japan to teach them, which was a compliment to her skills. But what I remember most about Vilma are our conversations through the years.
We talked about what was important to us at each stage of our lives. We talked about our children, about our husbands, about our families. We talked about politics and our respective governments and how they were messing up. We talked about everything and anything. And although we talked about race relations, writ large, we only had one conversation that I remember about Vilma's experience as a black woman. It was a time when some of Chris's relatives were moving to South Africa, which was still oppressed under apartheid at that time. And Vilma and Christina had surprised the Scott family with their very negative reaction to this move. And after we talked about this for quite a while, I asked, somewhat puzzled, "What did your family say when Chris brought home an African-American bride from Paris?" And she replied in her most haughty British voice, "Oh, my dear, they never noticed." Vilma, you were a dear friend, and I will miss you.
Many years later, long after I'd moved to Connecticut in 2001, I was chatting with Dolores Landry at a social gathering at my brother and sister-in-law's house in Alexandria. Dolores was an old friend of my mother's and Ernest Brody. They had all known each other from their days at Fisk University. Your mother never really felt she'd fit in here, explained Dolores, sidling up to me while her youngest granddaughter and Vilma's granddaughters were raced through the house, shrieking loudly. Continuing conspiratorially, she said, "I don't know if you know this, but I was the one who suggested to Vilma that she consider trying out Europe." "Oh, really? No, I didn't realize that." Well, her interest was so much more in line with the intellectual culture over there. I and some friends had gone over to Paris on a study abroad, and I had found that they were much more accepting and appreciative of black Americans than over here. So I just thought she'd find it much more her thing. We laughed at this realization. Ernest had been responsible for my ending up moving from England to Connecticut in the US, while Dolores had been responsible for my mother ending up in Paris. And we laughed at another coincidence. All three, Dolores, Ernest, and Vilma, had also somehow independently named their daughters Jennifer. In Paris, she enrolled as a student at the Sorbonne, where she took a course in French civilization, Études de la civilisation française. She soon fell in with an intellectual crowd of American and British expats. One of this new crowd of acquaintances was a young man called Christopher Scott, who was very taken by this strikingly beautiful, sassy young woman from New York. Chris was tall and gangly and awkward-looking, a Cambridge-educated Englishman with a mop of unruly red blonde hair, with grey eyes, cutting an intellectual figure in those popular large-rimmed black glasses, and emitting confidence and charm in an offhand manner. He too had fled to Paris to escape, but for him it was England he was escaping, which in his view represented oppressive intolerance and the superior attitude of a country that lacked cultural curiosity and to him seemed relatively dull. My mother must have represented everything that was different from that. He was smitten. She too was smitten. She was carried away by his fun and adventurous manner, and though her feathers were ruffled by his offhand teasing, she far preferred that to smothering advances. She liked that he valued her as an intelligent woman and for who she was as a person, unlike in America, where at that time race was always the first thing that came between people. They met, according to a newspaper article written about them in the Daily Herald, after they married in London in 1955. Written about them after they married in 1955 at a party in Paris, when she fell off a ladder and he caught her. There was a photo of the two looking young and trendy, my mother in the forefront with her dazzling smile, and my father standing a little behind her, tall and gangly with those big black rimmed glasses, looking somewhat dazed that someone like him had made such a catch. But why were you in the paper? We kids asked her when she showed us the now browned and frayed newspaper article they had kept. Well, because it was highly unusual at the time to have a mixed-race marriage. We were puzzled to hear this. Why would that be considered newsworthy? But we loved to hear the story and frequently asked her to tell it to us again. But that's not really how I remember it, Mummy would tell us regarding the newspaper article. I remember his being really rude. The first thing, about our dad. The first thing he ever said to me was something like, "Do you always wear your shirts unironed like that?" Taking on the haughty, teasing tone that she remembered him adopting. Sounds very like him, we thought, laughing, although she had to explain before we could understand that in those days everyone spent hours ironing their clothes and would never be caught dead going out without every item of clothing looking crisp, smart, and respectable. But some young people were starting to reject the idea of having to iron your clothes all the time. Once again, she was on the cusp of a new trend in fashion. In marrying my dad, my parents ensured that life would never be dull. My dad was charismatic and decisive, generally charging about with energy and purpose, playful and quick to spot the funny aspects of situations, attracting friends wherever he went and livening up any room he entered. Finding England too dull for his tastes and rejecting conventional life, he liked to travel around the world. The more exotic and culturally different from England, the better. A few years after getting married, they left England, where Christina had been born, and spent the 60s living in what they felt were more interesting places, where my dad was able to secure a job. We lived in Ethiopia, where I was born, Morocco, where Howard was born, Ghana, Ethiopia again, and then France. We made some lifelong friends, such as the Martins in Ethiopia and the Clarys in Paris, and my parents stored up a lifetime of stories of their adventures in these and other countries we also traveled in. My dad had been reluctant to return to England, but after 3 years living in Paris, our English was beginning to suffer. Finally, my mum had to put her foot down. She was done with all the traveling. We needed more stability. It was time to move back home. But she was from America while he was from England, so was home England or America? She had been traumatized by growing up black in America, so in the end, England won out. So after 12 years of traveling from country to country, we finally returned home, though Howard and I had never actually lived home before. But at last we could get to know all our cousins and our aunts and uncles better, at least the ones that on my dad's side of the family. Yet all this moving around had consequences. My mom left her home because she felt she could have a better life elsewhere, but then spent the rest of her life feeling like a foreigner in her adopted country. Despite this, she did live in England long enough that she was able to start putting down roots again, almost 60 years. In fact, she became more familiar with London culture and how things worked there than my dad, the one who was actually English. I thought it was notable, though, that she refused to apply for a British passport her entire life, despite the fact that she would not have had to give up her American passport to do so. And while she had traumatic memories of racism in her home country, she also had fond, distant, nostalgic memories of all the things from her childhood and early adulthood, only to be unpleasantly surprised on return trips. "Blah," she said after biting into a New York hot dog on a trip back home. "I was really looking forward to this, but this isn't what I remember it being like at all," she laughed. "Yuck!" Hershey bars were equally disappointing. Then there was that time when we were visiting her mother and brother, Julius, in Harlem on a trip to the States when I was 17. It was October 1978, during my autumn half-term break in school in London, and all the leaves were turning bright yellow. This was my first visit to the States in the fall. The last time we had visited had been summer when I was 11, and I was now seeing Harlem with older and wiser eyes. My parents had been buying a few food items to take up to my grandmother Nana's apartment on 135th Street and Lenox Avenue. At my mother's suggestion, we walked to a liquor store to buy some beer. "Are you sure we can get beer from a liquor store?" my dad asked skeptically. "Yes, Chris," she retorted in exasperation. "Really?" he objected. "I'm not sure if you're right." "Oh, I should know. I grew up here," she retorted, charging ahead from him dismissively. Daddy had a way of letting you know when he considered you wrong about something that drove Mummy crazy. But for once she felt she would have the upper hand. We were in her country now. They continued to argue as we made our way down the street until we came to a place with heavy bars barricading the entire street level front facade from the street. Was this the liquor store? Everything about it screamed, "Keep the hell out!" And I was inclined to agree. But instead, we pushed open the heavily barricaded door and went in. A man stood behind the counter, looking at us apprehensively. He too was barricaded from us behind a bulletproof glass and wire cage. I tried not to stare. What kind of place was this? "Can I help you?" he asked, sounding doubtful. Mummy, taking charge of the situation, said, "Yes, thanks. We want to get some beer." I stared at her. What had happened to her accent? It had suddenly had a beat and a swinging hipness to it that I had never heard coming out of her mouth before. Was this my mum? Embarrassed, I looked at the shopkeeper, expecting him to laugh in surprise at her funny accent too. The storekeeper looked surprised, but apparently not at her accent. He said, "Beer? You can tell you're not from round here, lady. You can't get beer from a liquor store." Out we all filed, Mummy laughing sheepishly, Daddy looking both victorious. "There, you see, what did I tell you?" While also grinning at and shrugging his shoulders apologetically to minimize any attacks for being smug. I too couldn't help grinning. But what I failed to notice at the time was just how desperately she wanted to finally be right about something she and my dad were arguing about. And even in her own country, her own turf, he won. It just wasn't fair. What she didn't seem to realize was that she was a formidable opponent herself. We all know her as someone who liked to argue her point on many topics she found interesting. Her book club friends, when she lived in London, were somewhat terrified of her, as she had some strong opinions and wasn't shy about expressing them. At the same time, her friends all enjoyed such lively discussions, remarking to me how interesting and knowledgeable she was, skilled at presenting sound arguments that might not have occurred to you. My childhood memories include many wonderful dinners cooked by my mom with such lively discussions with my parents' friends seated around the dinner table. Daphne was a frequent guest, and she and Vilma would talk and discuss things well into the night. And while Daddy could outcompete her on logical reasoning, Mummy wasn't too bad at this herself. And should she see defeat on the horizon, she wasn't above using whataboutisms as a counterattack. So round and round they would go, their words forming a dance around each other in a familiar argumentative tone, like a song they practiced together for years. Yet she was also a strong feminist and proponent of racial justice, and you'd better watch out if you found yourself at the receiving end of such debates. Mummy reigned supreme. She had a sense of righteous indignation on behalf of those at the lower end of society's power system, and when she got going, it was not at all timid about laying it all out exactly as she saw it. Since none of us, family and friends in England, had experienced growing up black in America, in fact, my parents had protected us as kids from that, and since she always made excellent and insightful points, any discussion that ventured into that domain saw her as the decided leader. Nevertheless, my parents still found themselves arguing around racial issues, usually at the dinner table, with close friends like Daphne, after a few glasses of wine. I sensed a lifelong underlying tension between her and my dad, as if she was projecting the battle between the races that she'd grown up with in America onto Daddy. And if she tried hard enough, one day she was finally going to win. But Daddy doted on her and respected her tremendously. Was she not aware that she had already won? Okay. I have one more part to read, but I'll take a little break.
Does anyone?
I have something from Dave.
I have a very brief tribute from an old friend, Dave Goulder, who wrote in and who's with us today on Zoom. So listen up, Dave. Here's your piece. And he writes, "Vilma was my pal, offering refuge from the stress of London and my touring." So Dave was from Scotland, and he was a musician, banjo player? Not
Not from Scotland.
Oh, where from?
Lived in Scotland.
Oh, I beg your pardon, he lived in Scotland. But anyway, so he was a musician and he toured a lot. And he goes on to say, after each gig, I scrambled back to Highgate Hill and my welcoming landlady, who liked what I liked, malt whiskey, classical music, jazz, quality drama, and conversation. A season of Samuel Beckett on TV. She taped the plays for us to watch together. We both played classical guitars, and she properly, me a self-taught eccentric. I stopped touring and we met only at funerals, and I regret being unable to attend this one. Dave Goulder.
Christina, did you want to say some words?
Really good. I don't know, because maybe this is, oh, thank you. That's fine. I think you picked it up on mistake. I left it on there, I swear to it. Second time, it's, yeah. Test. So you will probably hear many times today about Mummy's departure from the country of her birth. A ceremony like this may not seem the appropriate place to bring up politics, but in Mummy's case, not bringing up politics would be the inappropriate thing to do. Mummy lived and breathed politics, and in the last few years of her life, she spent much of her time either reading or watching the news and fuming at current events. She left this country in her 20s because she felt that, as a black woman, her own country would not give her the opportunities and freedoms available to her in post-World War II Europe. While racism and sexism were also present in Europe, she ended up staying abroad for almost 50 years, a period that included 9 years in Africa. Meanwhile, her children, having grown up overseas, all returned to the States to live out their lives. She often warned us about this nation's dark underbelly, but since my own experience varied greatly from hers, I simply thought that she was out of touch with the modern USA and was stuck living in the past. But it turns out she was right all along and knew what she was talking about. The ideals of this nation boasts about are not for everyone. Scapegoating and othering are as American as apple pie, and too many are perfectly fine with limiting the rights and opportunities of others, so long as they themselves are spared or their group is spared. So while my heart is buoyed by the thought that the last few years of her life, she was able to enjoy the last few years of her life around family, my biggest regret, after her elation at helping elect the nation's first black president, was that Mummy had to see the return and dominance of the politics of white grievance. If we are ever able to reverse the damage being done to our nation, unfortunately, Mummy won't be around to see it, and that makes me profoundly sad. Martin Luther King once said that the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. Mummy, I think, was heartbroken to find events possibly proving him wrong. And I hope that's not the case, but right now it's hard to feel optimistic.
I'll just say something very briefly.
She was a big fan of yours.
Yes.
So we appreciate it.
I was a big fan of Vilma's, and I think my only regret is that I did not get to meet her much earlier. The stories that Howard has told me of his time with you and Seth and Eric are definitely part of my understanding of Howard as well. I met Howard 40 some odd years ago in September of '83 at University of Michigan. After we graduated, did not see him for 14 years, and then we bumped into each other on the Metro platform here in DC, standing waiting for a DC United match, and we looked at each other side by side, and I looked up and said, "Howard?" And he looked down and said, "Eric?" And starting in 2000 or 2001, we recommenced our friendship. I've been fortunate to meet some of his friends who are in this room today, and I was especially fortunate to meet his wife, Laura, in this process. And then the cherry on top and everything else was having Vilma come out and visit and to spend her final years here. For me, hearing Vilma's story, which has been recounted here over the years, meant a lot to me as a mixed race person whose biological mother was black and father was white, but grew up in a white family in Michigan in a small town. And also has traveled the world as well with my family. So there's a lot of similarities. Vilma and my father were very similar. They were born about 8 months apart, and their similarities were so striking that I felt like I was sitting with my father when talking with her. Whether it was the scotch or the wine, the conversation, the deep desire to talk about politics, all of it. And I will say, in talking with her in the past few years, she was very happy to be back here with family. I know when Christina moved back from the West Coast, having Jennifer here in the North, having family down in Virginia, it meant so much to her to be around that. And for me, I was able to take a small trip through history, listening to her and hearing about her experiences. I really want to say it's unfortunate that I had to be at this time with her passing to learn all of these things about her. And I would say the work that you did, Jennifer, is a Yo person's effort. And I can't wait to read through this multiple more times, what you've written. It is a fairy tale ride, and I just want to say that I miss you, Vilma, very much.
Last part, I promise. Okay. Perhaps social expectations today might dictate that my mom did not have a successful life because she never really achieved a lifelong career where she could reach her potential. Instead, she gave up her career ambitions to support my dad's career and travel needs, devoting herself to raising their family and traveling with him from country to country. She really made it possible for Daddy to do all the many things he was respected for, which at that time was what wives were expected to do. She also seemed to lack confidence in her own abilities. I wondered whether it was easier for her to work at helping her family get their careers up and running than to invest in her own. Once I found a manuscript buried away in a file in the bottom of a cupboard in the office in our London home. It was by Vilma Scott. I looked it over and asked her about it, full of curiosity. Why had I not known she had written a novel? Oh, that, she laughed with embarrassment. Yeah, I used to fancy myself as a writer once. You sent this to Langston Hughes? I asked, reading the note at the top and feeling really impressed. What happened? Well, nothing actually, she said, turning away with embarrassment. He wasn't very interested. From what I could gather, she had felt put to such shame by this episode that she had folded up her writing ambitions from then on. I was surprised that it had not seemed worthwhile to her to persevere. While she had not lacked the kudos to put herself out there, she was too quick to admit defeat. I was also impressed at her story about how she had marched over to Picasso's studio in her early days in Paris when she was a striking 23-year-old and asked him if he would like to take her on as a model. Apparently, his reaction was along the same lines as Langston Hughes. What were these men thinking? But how do you measure success? She grew up in a world where there were social barriers to keep black people from gaining any measure of success in life. I had 2 strikes against me, Mummy told me when I asked her recently about her early life before she left the States. Because I was a girl, I was automatically seen as not good as a boy. And then, of course, I was black. But then she added, but on the other hand, I was luckier than my brother Julius. Being a girl, no one cared if I went off to college to get educated. But for Julius, being a black male, nothing he did that he valued was valued by society. Thanks to her education, she was able to escape that environment and go to Europe, while her brother and his sons remained stuck in Harlem with no prospects. I see how our mother brought the kids to New York where they had a chance of a better life, and our mother took that chance for a better life for us, though she felt she had to leave New York and even the States to achieve it. My memory of her was when I was a child. My memory of her when I was a child was that she was kind, loving, accepting, and patient. She would work for hours with us on our writing when we had essays due at school. I can still see her sitting at the dining room table with Christina for hours, papers scattered everywhere, while Christina, brows furrowed in frustration, worked on her latest essay, with Mummy providing the framework and direction she needed. Later it was my turn with my essays on Huckleberry Finn. I received the best education from my mom on how to write coherently and grammatically, and how to construct good arguments, on sentence construction, word choice, English, rules of grammar, etc., most of which was never taught to me at school. She had very high standards and would definitely let you know if she felt something was poorly written. 5 days before she died, while lying in her hospital bed, barely able to open her eyes, she wanted to know how my writing was going and was still offering to help me out with it. While writing this biography and the obituary, I could still hear her voice criticizing my sentences and recommending a different choice of words. We offspring feel we have her to thank for the pains she took with us, and for me at least, the fact that writing comes pretty easily now, and that for me, writing is fun. Yet she could also be very critical and impatient when she thought you were being overly sensitive and allowing others to push you around. You need to stand up for yourselves, she would say. She would never hesitate to speak her mind if something went against her moral standards. She and her brother used to spend her childhood playing in the streets in Harlem after school. They used to get into fistfights with school friends if they got pushed around. She would scold us for being spoiled because we had things so easy. Like once in Ethiopia when Howard and I were 6 and 7, and the little French boy next door thought it would be fun to shoot his BB gun at our faces. Howard and I went bawling into the house, crying that Christophe had shot us with his gun. She got very cross at us for being so spoiled that we would cry when someone shot us with a water pistol. But when we explained it was not a water pistol, it was a BB gun, out she marched, furious, and proceeded to scold Christophe instead. At least that time, we kids felt vindicated. My mom was already slowing down, walking with a cane, and gradually cutting out activities that she found too demanding by the time her grandchildren, Alex and Desta, were old enough to form memories of her. But my memories of how active she was, regardless of whether we were living in Ghana, Ethiopia, France, or England, you could always follow her progress around the house by the sound of those sandals she loved to wear that would make rapid flip-flop mummy noises as she moved rapidly around the house, busying herself with some activity or another, or the sound of her voice as she carried on long conversations with friends, extended family, or her own mother on the phone, interspersed with, uh-huh, uh-huh. As she listened, she was this very carefully, while I determined who it was she was talking to, this time by how English or American her accent sounded with her choice of words. I was always right. Yet with her very busy life and with all the adventures and travel that she and Daddy had been on, she always seemed surprised at how much I tried to pack into mine. Goodness, Jennifer, was a very frequent refrain from her as she watched me squeeze yet one more item into my already fully packed car, or watched me carry out some other impossible task, with only her remark giving me any clue that I was overdoing it again. Mummy ended up living in London for almost 60 years altogether. It was in London that she really made a life for herself. Daddy was always off in this or that country, while she stayed put, investing in all that London had to offer, making strong friends, becoming part of the community. London became her world far more than it did my dad's. She loved it when Chris was home, but she had a full life whether he was home or not. After her kids got older and her time opened up, she started to work for an adult education centre in London as a teacher of English as a second language for immigrants. She would have wonderful stories to tell us of her students over dinner later and the ingenious ways she came up with to help them learn English. I could tell that her students loved her because she understood what it feels like to be an outsider, how difficult English is to non-native speakers, and how challenging English culture is to foreigners. She took the time to really work with them to overcome some of the common problems she found many had with the language, unlike many of the native English teachers at the center. In fact, one of her Japanese students was so impressed, she invited my mom to Japan for a few months for a job teaching English there, an experience my mom absolutely loved. She returned there to teach the following year, and this time my dad came with her. For once, he followed her instead of her always following him to wherever he traveled. It was a highlight of her life. Then back home in London at the age of 50, she decided to take on the huge challenge of learning to play the classical guitar, completely ignoring the established view that once you pass into adulthood, you are too old to learn an instrument. Soon she was getting involved in amateur guitar concerts with fellow guitar students and getting completely absorbed in the world of classical guitar music, attending guitar classes at the Mary Ward Centre for Adult Education in Russell Square in London. Listening to Vilma guitar music takes me back to those evenings with Mummy, sitting practicing guitar on her knee, music in front of her, while the family sat watching TV or listening to her talk guitar with her guitar buddies. In London, she was also able to indulge in her love of gardening, and it's from her that I developed a delight in gardening myself. Just before my dad died in 1998, at the age of 70, he informed the family that everything was set up so that after he died, Vilma could continue to live in their home in London just as before. His doctor had given him the number of weeks he could expect to live after his cancer diagnosis, and in his usual logical but also caring way, he had clearly thought it all through. He traded in the old car and bought a new one for Vilma, and he had set things up financially so she could continue her activities and interests. She did continue to live in that house for the next 23 years, though it took a few years for Mummy to regain her equilibrium after the shock, pain, and grief of losing her lifetime partner. But eventually she became too old and the house just too big a responsibility. In October 2021, Howard, Laura, and her niece Claire spent several grueling weeks helping to empty out almost 50 years of life in that house, and Laura and Howard moved Vilma and her remaining possessions to the house in Virginia. The transition did not go terribly smoothly. She was sad to leave London, and it was a huge upheaval. She also balked at the idea of moving to Virginia. She had missed living through the major parts of the civil rights movement in the States. She had been away that whole time. In her mind, it was still 1951, and Virginia was still the Jim Crow era South, or the Jim Crow South. Her health deteriorated. 2 weeks after arriving in Alexandria, she was admitted to a hospital where she was diagnosed with congestive heart failure. This was the first of several hospital stays during the next few years, but Howard and Laura did everything they could think of to make their home her home, and to set things up so she could be as independent as she could be within her limitations. What was really tough for her was having to relinquish all her independence bit by bit as she became more and more dependent on others, especially on Christina and Howard, who became her primary caretakers. She'd always been fiercely independent as a young woman, and she valued her independent life in London, in her own house, and her many friends and community there. She understood how things worked in London. At least in Virginia, she was finally close to her family again, which she loved. But here she didn't understand how things worked at all. She was back to being a foreigner all over again. So she was around until she was nearly 100, just as she predicted. Don't start a sentence, let alone a paragraph, with the word so, I hear my mom saying. Daddy's departure was way too soon. After he was gone, we offspring fussed around like her protective hens, sending each other a volley of texts to discuss options as soon as her health showed any sign of plummeting. It used to drive her crazy. While it was wonderful for us to have her with us so long, it is true that life was not easy for her in the last few months, especially once she had to go on oxygen with no likelihood of ever coming off it again. Her own mother at 94 used to say, "Don't get old, Vilma." Vilma did not want to get old either. So now I am just glad that she doesn't have to struggle with poor health and lack of independence anymore. Still, I miss her terribly.
Yeah, she was a fighter, all right. One time, she came, I woke up and came downstairs, and she beat, a bailiff came to our house over a misunderstanding of a ticket, and she beat that bailiff out of the house empty-handed. The bailiff had just made a mistake somehow. I don't really remember the story, but usually bailiffs come to your house to come away with something, and they threatened her with taking away the TV, the furniture, and she just battled him face on, and he left empty-handed. And I was so impressed. She just wasn't gonna have it. She just stood her ground and fought back. And I just was in awe. And she did many things like that. She was just, really impressive. It's difficult for me to put it into words, but I looked up to her in many ways. And I just feel that she's now resting. That was the last image I had of her. And I just feel like she's resting. And so with that, I'm going to close this evening, this meeting, and say thank you all for attending. It's just lovely to see everybody's faces. Thank you for your contributions and your tributes. And thank you to the Zoom attendees all the way from Australia and Ireland and, England, Scotland, Germany, West Coast and the East Coast. And we're going to have ribs now.